Joins us live. Sherwin, so the Democrats have the House, but the Republicans are stronger in the Senate. For us here on the tip of Africa, try to explain what that means in terms of the balance of power in the states right now.
It means we have a divided country, Francis, that has delivered a divided government. The difference here is that the Democrats now have some power, as we mentioned in that piece, to hold this administration account. They had, of course, had no power really in the House of Representatives before this election. They had no power in the Senate because they were the minority and couldn't, if we look at one of the most recent examples in the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, they failed to be able to even stop that by a slim majority. But they failed. And so now they have the ability, as we mentioned in that piece, to subpoena records of the president. They can ask for his tax returns. They can launch investigations. They are the chairs now of subcommittees in Congress. So they will have the gavel rather than their Republican counterparts come January next year. Nancy Pelosi will be the speaker. She will decide when legislation is voted on. So they should be feeling a little better about themselves. But as we correctly point out in that piece, this has been no blue wave. Democrats failed to surprise in some of those tight seats in the Midwest, where President Trump won by some 20 plus 30 points in states like Missouri and Indiana and North Dakota. Texas, where Beto O'Rourke was this young, insurgent, vibrant candidate. He came close but was unable to seat Ted Cruz. And the president, of course, will say that I went to all of those states and I need certainly some accolades and some credit for being able to build what essentially was a red wall in the Senate. Democrats really failing dismally in the Senate to make really an impact there. They'll be satisfied with the House, but it certainly isn't the blue wave that we were talking about months ago, Francis.
Well, even though it's not a presidential election, it was seen as something of a referendum on U.S. President Donald Trump. But even there, do we have a clear showing at all?
I don't think it's clear. I think what we need to do is get into the weeds of kind of how the demographics turned out in this election. I think what you're going to see, and the map behind me is fairly reflective of that, is that essentially in the rural states, you still have strong support for this president. On the periphery of the map, the East Coast, the West Coast, the biggest cities, some of the suburban areas, even in those rural states, you are beginning to see a breakaway from support for this president. And the early analysis, Francis, is that white college-educated women that broke for the president in 2016 are taking a second look. They are not that comfortable with this president. Certainly his rhetoric on women, his demeanor in office, how he engages his political opponents hasn't sat very well with them. And so I think as the analysis comes in, we're going to see that women broke here. Women had a fundamental impact on this election. We are seeing more than 100 women in the United States Congress for the first time in the history of the United States. I think the previous record was around 85 seats for women out of a majority of 435 seats in the House of Representatives. That's now above 100. It's still less than 25%. Women still have a lot of work to do in terms of getting parity in the United States Senate. But I think in this election, they'll certainly take that. Women deserve some credit. I think they turned out in numbers, and that is being reflected in the number of women that are being sent to the United States Congress.
So, Sherwin, we have a bit of time while we're waiting for U.S. President Donald Trump to speak. Maybe take us through some of the upsets, some of those interesting states behind you.
Well, one of the interesting states, Florida, is Florida, Francis, where an incumbent, Bill Nelson, has just announced that he is going to call for a recount. He was running against the outgoing Florida governor, Rick Scott. And what you have in that Senate race is a less than 0.5% margin. Rick Scott is in the lead. And that in the state of Florida, in terms of state law, would immediately trigger an automatic recount. Now, you'll remember Florida is one of those interesting states. Hillary Clinton just lost it. It was critical to Donald Trump's ascendancy to the presidency. Take you back to the early 2000s, Gore versus Bush. Of course, the Supreme Court weighing in at the end in favor of Bush. Florida is one of those interesting states. The Democrats also had a chance in Texas. Texas was really coming down to the wire. Ted Cruz had a sort of +5, +8% advantage in the polling. At the end of the day, Beto O'Rourke got 48 point something percent, Ted Cruz around 50%, so the margin of victory was much, much more tighter. Democrats were also optimistic about Arizona. Arizona, of course, is where the outgoing and very critical Republican Senator Jeff Flake of this administration was not standing for re-election because he'd been too critical of the president. The person running to replace him and the Democratic challenger are in a very, very tight race in Arizona. Democrats did, though, manage to turn the Republican Senate seat of Nevada blue. So they'll take some succor and some satisfaction, certainly, from that. But on looking at it broadly, Republicans held firm in the Senate. Democrats did better in the House, but not as well as perhaps many had expected.
So you've outlined this divided country, but we heard officials saying we will strive for bipartisanship. A lot of people saying that the rhetoric has become really intense. But what are the chances, given these results, of and even a striving towards bipartisanship?
Nancy Pelosi, the incoming House Speaker, has been very clear that she will use certain investigative powers as leverage in terms of legislation. There is immigration reform that is needed in this country. There might be some trade-offs in terms of building a wall and getting the Dreamers a path to citizenship. So we might not see from the get-go Democratic committees launching investigations into the Trump administration, but that is certainly an option. And let's run through what the Democrats can do. They can subpoena the tax records that the president has not revealed. They can ask for his financial disclosures to get a sense of who his business relationships have been with. They can also relaunch investigations from a congressional perspective into the Russian investigation. They also now have the ability to protect the Mueller investigation. You'll remember that the members of the Freedom Caucus of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives have called into question the legitimacy of the Robert Mueller investigation and urged the president to disband it. Democrats want to protect that. Also, some interesting elements in this election has been the sending to the border of thousands of U.S. military troops for this invasion that isn't really an invasion, this caravan that is sort of snaking its way at a snail's pace to the southern border with Mexico. And so they would want to investigate whether this was a correct decision by the president or whether this, as President Obama had indicated during this campaign, was a political ploy. Another thing that the Democrats are now able to do is they can protect the Affordable Care Act. Remember, this is the signature legislation of the Obama administration, what was dubbed Obamacare, and Republicans have tried to gut it time and time again. You'll remember the late Senator of Arizona, John McCain, being that deciding vote in the Senate that saved Obamacare. Now they have a barrier in the House of Representatives to save that legislation. And of course, the House of Representatives can invoke articles of impeachment. Now, I've just seen an interview on television here with one of the senior Democratic leaders, Francis, in the House, and they've said, we don't want to invoke articles of impeachment. We want the Mueller investigation to run its course, and then we can cross that bridge when we get there.
So this all has implications, finally, Sherwin, for the next presidential election, if not earlier for the president himself. But certainly, can we say that Americans seem to be fired up about democracy? There's huge eagerness, huge enthusiasm right now about the importance of the vote.
I think they're fired up about democracy, but I don't think that's how they would describe it. I think they're fired up about the right or the left. I don't think they necessarily see that as democracy. They just want to basically protect the silo that best represents who they are. Donald Trump is very popular in this country. There is no question. There is a Trump effect. We saw that. The Democrats were talking about a blue wave a few months ago. The president got out there. He started putting ads out, whether you disagree with those ads or not, whether they're born out of fact or fiction. They worked. People turned out. They were encouraged. The Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearing really divided this country and re-energized the Republican base. And even if you were a Republican that didn't like this president, the way they feel that Brett Kavanaugh was treated really motivated them to turn out for Republicans in this election. So let's not kid ourselves. President Donald Trump is the Republican Party right now. There is going to be no prospect of them getting rid of him. He's very powerful. When he comes out, people turn out for him and the candidates that he represents. You remember, Francis, he constantly said that if I'm not on the ballot, but pretend that I'm on the ballot. If you want to vote for Marsha Blackburn, who is the Senate candidate in Tennessee, vote for me. That's a vote for me. And so that was his rhetoric in here. And I think he will take, in a few moments, he'll be speaking in the East Room of the White House. The president will take a victory lap, but Democrats will take theirs later.
All right, so we're waiting for the U.S. president to speak. Very quickly, what do you expect him to say? Give us a bit more.
He will thump his chest. He did a great job. I can't believe people are criticizing me. The fake media don't believe them. No, he will definitely take a victory lap, and as he should. I think the president did have an impact on this election. I mean, Democrats have lost ground in the Senate, and the Senate is a crucial advocacy confirmation body in this in this government. They determine who sits on the Supreme Court, and we have a very aging, liberal, progressive justice in the likes of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who at 86, has had health concerns in the past, and so Democrats will be hoping, clearly that she remains healthy and stays in that position, Francis.
All right, thank you for your analysis, as always, to our correspondent in the U.S., Sherwin Bryce-Pease. And we're waiting, could just be moments away. U.S. President Donald Trump expected to thump his chest, as Sherwin suggested. We'll take you live as soon as we can. Let's take a quick